I used to be a massive bookworm. I absolutely devoured books. As a kid, I went through the Harry Potter series in like a month. I tore through series like The Hunger Games, The Maze Runner, Percy Jackson. I got really into the Star Trek Extended Universe novels. And then in 2018, I went to university. And like many people, I completely stalled. I know that people say that reading books and collecting books are two entirely different hobbies, but I don't want that to be the case. I love books. So, hi, I'm Thomas. I'm a PhD student in astrophysics at Cardiff University, and I finally have time to read again. And you're the ones that are going to keep me accountable. I decided to get back into reading properly at kind of the end of 2023, and part of that decision was that I wanted to be able to read more broadly, but also to talk about books on this channel, both the fiction books that I enjoy and books that are more relevant to what I talk about on this channel and astronomy and that sort of thing. The goal with this is to highlight what I'm reading and share books you might be interested in, and then, if we're really lucky, get a sort of little book community, book club type thing going on over on the Discord. Link is in the video description below. So in this first episode, I'm going to be talking about the books that I've read in the past few months, sort of since the last couple of months of 2023 up to now, in early April 2024. Any of the books that I talk about in this video will have associated reviews over on my Storygraph profile. The link to that will be in the description down below. Storygraph is kind of like Goodreads, but not owned by Amazon. It's where I keep track of what I'm reading, and again, yeah, little reviews on there. But I digress. Enough preamble, let's talk about the books. So I read or listened to 3 books in the last couple of months of 2023. The first of these was Artemis by Andy Weir. Artemis is a book I've wanted to read for a really long time, ever since I finished The Martian, Andy Weir's first book. I've actually made an entire video about the issues with the movie adaptation's ending of The Martian. That's over on Simon Clark's channel. Go check that out in the top right hand corner. Artemis is another science fiction book, this time set on the moon rather than Mars. It's set in the first lunar city called Artemis, and it follows Jazz Bashara, a smuggler who gets caught up in an almost heist-like storyline. It involves industrial espionage, sabotage, and cartel enforcers. Now, I had high standards going into this. I love The Martian. It's probably one of my favourite books that I've ever read. So I had really high standards going into this, and they were sort of met. Artemis did deliver on the whole. The character of Jazz is relatively believable, probably not as believable as Mark Watney was in The Martian, but generally speaking, Andy Weir does protagonists well. Where I think the book lacks quite a lot is in development of secondary characters, something that wasn't really an issue in The Martian because Mark Watney is generally on his own. I just found that these secondary characters were a little bit flat, a little bit underdeveloped, and there were quite a few plot points that hinged on their relationships with Jazz, the main character, that were kind of just mentioned as they were happening, as opposed to there being any sort of build-up. Despite the slightly lackluster characters, I still think it's a solid book. If anything, it's probably a slightly more solid book than The Martian. It's just not quite as good a story. I don't know. It's hard to compare them because they're quite different but also similar. The one thing that they really get right is that the science involved in Artemis has significantly above average accuracy for a sci-fi book, and I really enjoyed reading it as a scientist. After Artemis, I turned to an audiobook that obviously I don't have a physical copy of here. This is going to be a bit of a feature going forwards. I read physical books, I also listen to audiobooks when I'm doing things like the dishes or cleaning or whatever. I decided to dip back into audiobooks with a re-listen? I'm not sure. Of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief. There was the Disney Plus series coming out at the end of 2023, and I wanted to have reread the book before watching the series because, you know, it's nice to do that. It's a light read. I enjoyed it. Part of that is the nostalgia, having read it as a kid. Part of it is the Greek mythology, because I find that really interesting. The one thing that really bugged me with this was that the narrator for the default edition of the audiobook on Audible, the narrator sucks. I can't remember his name. His voice was really annoying and it was really slow. I had to get up to minimum 1.5 speed just to make it tolerable. Some of the voices that he put on for the characters were terrible, and there were just some words that were completely mispronounced. If I can find a version of the later books that has a different narrator, I probably will do that, because I don't know if I can do it with this narrator again. One thing I'm trying to do generally is not just read fiction, and to read some non-fiction books as well, and where possible, books written by authors with different lived experiences from me. That's where this next book comes in. Invisible Woman, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. This book does exactly what it says on the cover. It is a challenge to the societal norms in a way that I didn't fully expect. Some of the things discussed are more obvious, like the impact of women entering the workforce over the last century being beneficial to GDP, but detrimental to a lot of women who are still expected to do housework and be the primary caregivers in their families. Other aspects I didn't expect were like the aspects of impact on city planning, or bias in medical testing, or even failed attempts at gender neutrality, particularly with things like public bathrooms. I actually found this book really infuriating to read. Not anger at the book is really good, and not anger at the author either. She's written a brilliant book. It's very well paced, brilliantly referenced. No, I was getting angry at society in general, at my own preconceptions. It's a challenging book to read, especially if you think of yourself as being very much someone who prioritizes equality of outcomes, not just equality of inputs. In talking about this, I'm actually reminded of a line from Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Every time I think I understand how bad it is, it's just way worse than I imagined.
I think that's a good reaction to have, all things considered. I think this book should be mandatory reading, especially for anyone in a position of power in any sort of institution. It can start that conversation about the fact that gender equality and equality in general is more than just not being a dick. Invisible Woman was the last book that I read in 2023, so from here on out, anything that I talk about falls under my 2024 reading challenge, which I'm tracking through the Storygraph website. My aim is to read 24 books in 2024, which averages out as 2 per month, but as you will see, it is not going to be exactly 2 every month. Whether this is actually going to be achievable or not is another question. I don't know. I have quite a few rather dense books or very long books. There are some shorter ones, so I'm hoping that it balances out, but along with audiobooks, I think it's possible, but maybe not probable. The first book I read in 2024 was another non-fiction book, this time returning right back to my wheelhouse with astronomy, with The Last Stargazers, the enduring story of astronomy's vanishing explorers by Emily Levesque. Now, as you might expect, I'm coming to this book with a fairly non-standard perspective. I am a professional astronomer. That is my career path, but at the same time, I am not an observer. I do simulations, I do computational astronomy, so a lot of the stuff about observations that they're talking about in this book are new to me. I don't know what happens at telescopes. I don't understand a lot of that stuff. So it's a rather unique perspective. So take all of what I'm saying with a massive grain of salt, unless you're also a computational astrophysicist. It's definitely a book that gives you a first-person look into the world of professional astronomy. It lets you see how people work at these big observatories in Chile and Hawaii and other places around the world. But at the same time, it's also a bit of a love letter to observational astronomy. The whole point of the book is that observational astronomy has changed a lot over the last century, and that it is still changing. Where people used to have to climb into cages at the focus point of telescopes, they now sit in the adjacent room, and over time that may become a rarity as people can use the power of the internet to run their telescope observations from their office at their university. I think this book is really well conceived, but I'm not convinced that it's the best executed. Like I said, part of the book is about the future of astronomy, but that's only really the last 50 pages of the book. If you're interested in the history of astronomy and how astronomy has changed in the past century up to now, then this is definitely the book for you. It is not what I expected. I expected there to be more about the present and the future of astronomy than there is, and I think it's that imbalance that bugged me the most, particularly because those last 50 pages where the author is talking about the present and the future of astronomy is where we got the most enthusiasm and the most look into the author's character. I just wish more of the book had been about that and like that, with that level of enthusiasm throughout. A small bonus though is that this book is really easy to dip in and out of, reading a quarter of an hour here or there. It's been perfect for how I've been reading books quite a lot over the last couple of months, which has been on buses. But on buses is not where I listened to this next book, which is A Life on Our Planet, My Witness Statement and a Vision for the Future by Sir David Attenborough. With the audiobook narrated by David himself, this was an absolute joy to listen to. This book is part autobiography, part science book, and part plea to the reader to have some hope and work to preserve our natural world. I think that the audio format is definitely the way to go with this. It adds something to the intensely personal account of David's life and the experience of the natural world. How he's seen the natural world change with an incredible loss of biodiversity. At times it was really harrowing to listen to and really contributed to some of the apathy I've had towards our ability to deal with the climate crisis over the past few months. The second part of this book is, however, the complete opposite. David Attenborough lays out his vision for how we can save the natural world, rewild it, deal with the climate crisis, and prevent further catastrophic biodiversity loss. It is wide-ranging, it covers almost every aspect of the environmental and climate systems, and listening to him speak about it really made it hard not to regain some of the hope that had been lost through the first part of the book. At the same time, I do feel that while it's a good antidote to the despair of the first half of the book, it does focus a little bit too much on the small-scale actions. It almost makes you forget that small-scale actions like decarbonising the energy grid of some nations or improvement to farming practices isn't going to be enough to offset the levels of emissions from huge nations like the US or China. There was also quite a lot of discussion on carbon capture and storage technology. The idea that is quite often presented as a way to tech bro our way out of the climate crisis by pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere. While there's definitely a place for this technology in the overall climate solution, particularly for industries that can't be decarbonised entirely or early enough, I worry that this falls into the same category as the language at the COP28 Climate Summit, where there was too much focus on technology and not enough on government policy. So where does that leave me? Where do I stand on this book? Well, ultimately I like it. I really like the book, but it's not perfect. It's a book I'm glad exists. It's definitely a hopeful book about the climate crisis, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's something that's a bit of a rarity in the climate and environmental science sphere at the minute. And like I said, audiobook is definitely the way to go. But that brings us to the last book that I've been reading in these first few months of 2024, which is Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. This may come as a surprise, but it is the first time I have read this book. I'm currently on my first time through the Lord of the Rings series. I read The Hobbit as a kid. I fully intended to read The Lord of the Rings, and I just never got round to it. I think I probably fell prey to the reputation it has as a rather monumental read. I read The Fellowship of the Ring during my undergrad, and I found it really slow, but I'm stubborn, and I want to be able to say that I've read the series. Fortunately, The Two Towers is better. It is still anything but fast-paced, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. With Fellowship, I loved the world building. It is something that Tolkien does better than just about anybody. But I think it came at the expense of the pacing. The Two Towers is better, but don't get me wrong, it is still a Tolkien novel. There is still a lot of world building. However, the pacing is better, and I think this is partially to do with the plot, because at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, sorry, this is mild spoilers for a book that came out decades ago, the Fellowship is broken, the party splits up, so you're now following multiple different storylines. We're following Sam and Frodo as they head off to Mordor, we're following Pippin and Merry as they join up with the Ents and march on Isengard, and we're following Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli as they join up with Rohan for the Battle of Helm's Deep. There's a lot more going on with this book. We don't follow one path too long. So as much as it's still a relatively slow read and a very dense read, it feels fresher. You're not stuck with one plot line for the entirety of the book. I do have one problem with this book though. One major problem, and that is that I have seen the movies too many times. It leads you to read the dialogue of the character as if it's the actor saying it, and I find this happens the most with characters who have distinctive accents in the movies. The characters like Samwise Gamgee or Gimli. But putting aside the conflict in my brain, I really like this book. As I've said, I love Tolkien's world building. It's great, and I'm really looking forward to reading the conclusion of this series at some point. It is not going to be the next thing I read, because this book is also the reason I've only so far read 3 books in 2024. I'm going to take a little bit of a break from Middle-earth before I read Return of the King to get me sort of back on track to my reading challenge. So that's what I've been reading. What will I be reading next? What will feature in the next one of these videos on books? The next book on my radar is back in the world of popular science. I'm going back actually to climate stuff, and I'm going to be reading Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Hardwired to Ignore Climate Change by George Marshall. This book was recommended to me as kind of a must-read for anyone interested in the climate crisis, so if that's you, then maybe you should read it too. I'd really like to know what you're reading at the minute. Have you read any of the books I've talked about in this video? Let me know in the comment section down below. Down there you'll also find a link to our Discord server. Like I said, I want to get a little bit of a reading community book club thing going on over there, so if that sounds like your sort of thing, come and join us over on Discord. If you're looking for something else to watch, there is some recommended viewing on screen now. But until then, have a very good rest of your day and happy reading. See ya.